in 10 seconds, in 9, in 8, in 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Happy 1994!
That's right, everyone. 30 years ago this month is back. It is now 2024 today. Happy New Year, everybody, which means we are going to be celebrating the year 1994. All fucking year. If you're new, this is a series of videos where I, old head, reminisce about my early teenage days and the stuff I was watching, the stuff I was listening to, the stuff that was important to me. And we do this for each and every month of the year. So now it's time for January 1994. Now there have been a few updates to the format here. The first one being the Hot 10. Oh, I'm sorry.
The Hot 10.
So last year, the Hot 10 was me talking about the top 10 most popular songs on the Billboard Hot 100. And I would sing a little bit of some of the songs, and some people would get really annoyed at that, and other people thought it was hilarious. But to be fair, one entire year of me singing is enough. If you really, really want to hear me sing more, check out my new single, Shift, from my side project, solo project, Supporting Actor. I dropped this new track last month at some point. You'll find the link in my Linktree shit in the description. But that's the present. We're talking about the past, 1994. So what I've decided to do with the Hot 10 now is, instead of talking about the top 10 most popular songs, because by 1994, I had really sort of forged my own way musically. And sure, I was still listening to some stuff that was mainstream, but I wasn't really that interested in what the top pop songs were or whatever. I'd become much more of an album person. So I decided that now the Hot 10 is going to be the top 10 albums in the country. Plus, this actually gives us a better view of what was going on musically with people at the time, because the Hot 100 has a lot to do with like radio plays, which, as we all know, sometimes there's a little payola involved in that sort of shit. But at this point, by 1994, the top 10 or the top 200 albums on Billboard was generated off of legit album sales. So sure, there probably could have been some fudging of the numbers somehow, but I feel like this is a much more legitimate snapshot of what people were actually listening to. So here we go. So this is the top 10 for the first week of January. At number 10, the Beavis and Butthead Experience. Occasionally we're going to find albums on this chart that represent me. I fucking bought that one. At number 9, we have Billy Joel with River of Dreams. Did he do an album after River of Dreams? If he did, I don't remember it. I mean, I know he's still out there doing shows and shit, but has he put out an album since 94? At number 8, Common Thread, the Songs of the Eagles. I don't even remember this. It was an Eagles cover album, and I'm not the target audience for that at all, nor was I in 1994. At number 7, Miss Jackson, If You're Nasty, with Janet. That's a lot of fucking bangers on that one. At number 6, Michael Bolton with The One Thing. I know not one thing about that album. Number 5, Meatloaf, Bat Out of Hell 2, Back into Hell. Man, that album was huge, and I still don't get it. At number 4, Frank Sinatra, Duets. Never heard this album, nor do I want to hear this album. I'm assuming it's that similar thing. They did it with a few artists where they took some old tracks and they put contemporary artists singing with the old artist, and everybody had a really boring time. At number 3, Snoop Doggy Dogg with Doggy Style. That one was definitely on my radar, but not as much as number 2, Pearl Jam with Verses. That album was number 1 for a little bit last year. The boys did pretty good for themselves on this one, but not good enough to keep Mariah Carey from the top of the charts. Number 1, Mariah Carey with Music Box. I don't really know much about that album. I don't remember what singles were on that album, but I'm pretty sure there are some bangers on there. It's fucking Mariah Carey. Like I said, I feel like doing it this way gives us a much more accurate snapshot of what people were actually listening to. So I hope you enjoyed it. Moving on. Okay, now's the time when we talk about the number one movies in the country for the month of January 1994. Now, a lot of people ask me to talk about the movies that I was interested in at the time. But like I said on a previous episode, there were movies I was very excited about. But by this point, I was so buried in discovering music that I barely watched any movies or any TV. In the month of January, there were no movies that came out that I went to go see, and none of them really stood out as something that I should even talk about. So here are the number one movies in the country for January 1994. For the first week, it was Mrs. Doubtfire. Robin Williams still hanging in there at the number one spot, but all of a sudden, the mood drastically changed for the second and third week of January 1994. The number one movie in the country was Philadelphia. Now look, I've heard this is a great movie, but in 1994 and in 2024, I have no desire to watch this movie. It seems sad as fuck. And life already has enough sad as fuck things in it. I don't need my entertainment to also make me sad as fuck. So I've never seen it. But apparently after 2 weeks of that, the movie going public in the US, they were like, fuck this. We want to go back to some lighthearted shit. So once again, number one for the fourth week of January, Mrs. Doubtfire. Ironically enough, now a movie that if I watched it today would probably make me feel sad as fuck. All right, now here's where we talk about the albums that came out in January of 1994. On January 4th, the second album from Lagwagon, Trashed. I love this album. This is my favorite Lagwagon album. This is pretty much where I discovered them, around this time, maybe a little bit after this. But to me, this is one of the quintessential skate punk albums that has that sound that I love. And on top of that, at this point, Derek Plourde is still the drummer of the band, and he fucking rules. Rest in peace, Derek Plourde. I hope I'm saying his last name right. I always feel like I'm saying it wrong. It's one of those names. On January 18th, the fifth album from King's X, Dogman. Fucking killer album. I remember seeing the video for the song Dogman when it first, I don't know if it was the first airing on MTV, but it was 94. And I was just like, man, I was already into King's X, but I'm like, holy shit, they got heavier. This was the first one where they finally worked with a different producer, and they worked with Brendan O'Brien on this one, and he really fucking brought something out of him, because this album is fucking killer. On the 25th, probably the biggest release of January, in my opinion, Jar of Flies, the second or third EP from Alice in Chains, depending on if you count We Die Young. But this was a huge EP for me in 1994. I bought it on cassette, and I feel like almost for the entire first half of the year, my headphones were on and I was listening to Jar of Flies. And fun fact about this album, it was the first EP to hit number one on the Billboard charts, but that happened in February, so we'll be talking about this guy again. Last but not least, also on the 25th of January 1994, the fourth album from Prong, Cleansing. I remember thinking this album was so fucking cool when it came out. I remember thinking to myself, it's like dance metal. Never heard that before. Of course, everybody knows the single Snap Your Fingers, Snap Your Neck. That's on this. That gives you a good idea of what this album sounds like. It's impressively, meticulously done metal from Prong. All right, that's everything I have for you for January of 1994, but I am not done with you yet. Who wants to go back another 10 years? So over the past year, I've had a good number of comments where people were asking why I didn't talk about 40 years ago this month, from the early to mid 80s. And up until this point, I shied away from that, because the whole idea of these videos is me talking about my experience in being involved with the music that's coming out. 1983, I was 5 years old. I wasn't involved in anything. But 1984 is a different story, because I was only 6 years old, but that is where I can literally draw a line to exactly where everything started for me getting into music, getting into the music that would directly lead me to becoming the guy that wastes all his fucking money on this shit behind me. So every month there'll be a segment at the end where I talk about the albums that are somehow meaningful to me from 1984, 40 years ago this month. Now, I noticed that looking up release dates for the 80s, especially the early to mid 80s, some of it doesn't make any sense. I'm like, did this really come out on a Thursday? I mean, anyway. So bear with me, but I'm going to go with whatever's written in Wikipedia. So let's start off on January 6th, 1984. The first album from one of my favorite bands of all time comes out. Fistful of Metal from Anthrax. The one and only album with Neil Turbin on vocals and Dan Vilker on bass. And when I ended up getting into Anthrax around 1990 and I went back to all their older stuff, this was the one album that I struggled with the most because I guess it's more speed metal than thrash really. But over the years, it's really grown on me. And of course, you know, being one of my favorite bands of all time, I love every period of the band. So this is just a nice little beginning chapter of Anthrax. All right, January 9th, 1984 is when I read this album came out, and it is the album that started it all for me. 1984 from Van Halen. I've talked about this album a lot at different places on my channel, different videos, podcast, everywhere, because this is so important to me. I just remember seeing the music videos for Jump and Panama and Hot for Teacher, and something happened in my 6-year-old brain, and I said, I need this album. And my mom bought it for me on cassette. And really that led me into all of a sudden looking for anything that I felt could be like this. And the rest is history. This would be at the time the last album with David Lee Roth on vocals. And honestly, I prefer the David Lee Roth era, but man, I love me some fucking Sammy Hagar. So, it's a sort of a bittersweet thing because I love this album so much, but 5150 is pretty fucking great too. All right, last up for January 1984, the 13th of 1984, Defenders of the Faith from Judas Priest. Now, this is famously, well, on my channel, famously my favorite Judas Priest album, because when Cranked and Ranked, when Eddie and I did our ranking of Judas Priest, this is a couple years ago now, and I really was not that into much Judas Priest, but this one was the one that I ended up singling out as my number one Judas Priest album. Since then, over the past year, I have become a moderate Judas Priest fan, enough to where I've bought all of their 70s and 80s albums. And while I still think that this one's probably at the top for me, I think that the ranking needs to be revisited now. But this is a fucking killer album. What the fuck was I thinking? Just that's why I'm not very quick to shit on something, because you never know. Many years later, you're going to be doing a video and being like, what the fuck was wrong with me? All right, that's it. We got to talk about January 1994 and January 1984. I hope you all feel very fulfilled. And of course, I will be back next month to fill you again with stuff from February of 1994 and 84. Okay. That's it for this video, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all again next month.